Aman, Sharag, check live now.
Live right now.
The guest has joined.
Siddhita, I think you can start now.
This will be a speaker session followed by a moderated question and answer session. A very good afternoon to one and all who have joined us today. Our honorable guest, Padma Bhushan Professor Ved P. Nanda, Assistant Professor Dr. Seema Singh, Faculty Convener of DDS, Assistant Professor Dr. Vandana Mehelwar, also a Faculty Convener of DDS, respected faculty members, guests, students, and all the viewers in the audience. On behalf of Campus Law Center and Debate and Discussion Society, I, Siddhita Singh Rathore, Executive Member of DDS, extend our gratitude and regards to Sir for gracing us with his esteemed presence and extend a warm welcome to all of those who have joined us today. The theme of today's session is India's permanent membership in UN Security Council. As a founding member of the United Nations, India strongly supports the purposes and principles of the UN and has made a significant contribution in implementing its goals. India has also been a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council for 8 terms. In the light of this, it gives us immense pleasure in organizing this lecture today. When discussion is the ethos of an institution, debate and discussion society becomes a natural facilitator to the spirited culture of indulging in constructive dialogues. The society not only conducts debates and discussions, but also promotes free thought and opinion exchange. We conduct a plethora of events covering various facets of the society in general and legal field in particular. To welcome our guest and to deliver his welcome address, I would now like to open the floor to Dr. Seema Singh, Faculty Convener of DDS. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much. Nanda sir has left or he is still there? I can't see him. Can you see them?
Yes,
Can you
ma'am,
see
he's
him?
here.
He's
Yeah.
there.
Please.
Sir, namaskar, sir. Sir, please unmute yourself, sir.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, sir. Now I can hear you. We can
Wonderful,
hear you.
wonderful. Kirti ji, thank you. Thank you for your kind introduction. And Seema ji and all my colleagues and friends, I'm very delighted to be with you today, this afternoon. And I know that you have had trouble in trying to arrange this program. And so I'm deeply grateful and thank you all for being here. Today's topic is an absolutely essential, imperative, important topic. And the reason simply is that today, the United Nations Security Council has become totally dysfunctional. It has not been able to perform its own functions. Let me take you back very briefly about the veto problem. Many of you probably know that after the end of the Second World War, the League of Nations had died. And after its demise, the thought was that we still do need an international organization that can be responsible for international peace and security. 2 world wars, total destruction, devastation, so many people killed, and how to end wars. League of Nations had not been successful. There was no enforcement. And then the thought was that we ought to create an organization that has enforcement powers, an organization that has the ability to maintain international peace and security. And once that peace and security is disturbed, then at that time, that they can restore international peace and security. So maintaining international peace and security, restoring international peace and security, that was the main task that they had in mind. And perhaps you remember or know that there were 3 important people who sat down in order initially to think about the framework for the new international order. And those 3 were Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill. And at that time, the thought simply was that those victorious powers, that they ought to assume the responsibility. And the responsibility would be a joint responsibility. And it would be security that is going to be collective security. That these 5 permanent members that are today, these were the ones who were victorious. United States, Russia, France, England, China. And the point was that all these 5, they would collectively ensure that there is an umbrella of security. And under that umbrella, the entire world would be there. That these are the countries that would have the nuclear power. These are the countries that would have permanent seats in the Security Council. And in the Security Council, they would be the ones who would be responsible for that peace and security. So this was the thought by Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt. Then came the San Francisco Conference, where the United Nations was going to be formed, UN Charter was going to be drafted, and then the countries met. You may remember that at the time, after the Second World War, there were only 51 countries that were members of the UN. India was one of them. And in San Francisco, when the drafting was being done, then the question again arose about the Security Council, about the veto. And at that time, you may or may not recall, what happened is that all these other countries, but for these 5, most of the other countries, they said there ought not to be any veto, that we should have decision by 2/3, 3/4 of the General Assembly. And then the decision still was that we ought to have an executive body that is called Security Council, and on the Security Council, not all members of the United Nations. But then the question was 5 permanent members with a veto. No decision could be taken in the United Nations without these 5 either concurring or at least abstaining. And at that time, these 5 members, they all insisted that they must have a veto, because then they are the ones who would assume the responsibility for international peace and security for the entire world. That was the setting. Now, these 5 permanent members insisting, the remaining insisting that there should not be a veto, how to resolve it? And there was a stalemate. And in that, one of the United States delegates, who was a member of the Senate, Senator Connolly, he dramatically stood up. He had in his hand the charter, drafted charter. He took it. I'm not going to do it, but he tore it to pieces. Had those pieces in his hand, and he told the 51 members. He said to those 46 members who were not among those 5 permanent members, he said, no, you can certainly go back to your own countries and you can say that you are very successful in not having a veto. But then they are going to say, where is the UN Charter? And he had torn it to pieces. And the message was totally clear that without these permanent members having a veto, there will be no United Nations. That is how the veto came. Now, very quickly, there has been abuse of veto. There has been misuse of veto. You remember what happened is that after the United Nations came into being, pretty soon after that, in the United Nations, in the world community, Cold War started. And those clouds were big and they were looming large. And for the next many, many decades, you remember that those shadows lingered. United Nations could not move. In the Security Council, there were vetoes. 1945, just at the very beginning, after the Cold War had begun, Russia, at that time, the Soviet Union, started vetoes. So that is the beginning of the veto. And today, if you really want to look at it, there have been 300 vetoes used. Look back at history. The killing fields of Cambodia. You go all over Africa. Because it's not one country, it's not genocide, simply in Rwanda. But you can see civil war, you can see atrocity crimes, you can see torture, you can see ethnic cleansing, you can even see genocide. And the Security Council could not do anything about them because the United States and the Soviet Union, they were in a clash, ideological clash. And that continued for decade after decade. And so today, as we look at the Security Council is moribund. Russia attacked Ukraine. The Russian forces came in. The United Nations Charter is very clear. Article 2, paragraph 4. It says that in international relations, you must not use force, that there are peaceful means, mediation, arbitration, conciliation, all kinds of peaceful means, but that in international relations, use of force is prohibited. Not only use of force, but even threat to the use of force is prohibited. And if there is a threat to the use of force, if there is a breach of peace, if there is aggression, and remember these three magical terms: breach of peace, threat to the peace, or aggression. Once that happens, then the Security Council can move into action. That is what the Charter says. And what does the Security Council do? You probably know, if you have studied the United Nations, or otherwise you also know, that the United Nations then says, the Security Council says to both countries, stop fighting, have ceasefire, give peace a chance. There might be a possibility of getting a package deal. Democracy is there in many countries, but diplomacy might work. And so ceasefire, stop fighting. Countries don't. Iraq moved into Kuwait. Saddam Hussein said, we are going to take over Kuwait. United Nations said, stop fighting. They didn't. And at that time, what the United Nations Security Council did was what it usually does. After ceasefire hasn't worked, it would take economic sanctions. Stop trade. Don't fly your planes over that country. Bring back your ambassadors. No diplomatic relations. Cut off trade relations. Don't send any armaments. So economic sanctions, economic measures, they fail. And then the United Nations Security Council says that under these circumstances, sky is the limit. Force can be used. And that is where the Security Council totally fell apart, because you know that during the last many years, it's not Syria, it's not Ethiopia, it's not Ukraine simply, it was not Rwanda, but ethnic cleansing, genocide, conflicts, they have been all around. And because of this ideological tension between the United States and Soviet Union and now Russia, and that ideological strain and tension was such that the Security Council could not function. Security Council had simply vetoed. And that is where you probably remember or don't remember, it doesn't matter. But in the Security Council, the issue came up of Ukraine. Russia was there with a veto. Security Council could do nothing. Resolution was put forward to stop the war. Resolution was put forward to criticize Russia for violating the UN Charter. UN Charter simply says sovereignty, territorial integrity. Countries are all equal. Do not use force against any country. But nothing happened because of the Russian veto. And because of Russia's veto, then all of a sudden, for the first time, after many, many years, the Security Council said, let us send this particular issue to the General Assembly. Here I want to take you back in history, and you may not have studied it, but I don't see all those videos, so I can't ask the question. But I would have asked the question, how many of you know Uniting for Peace? Uniting for Peace was a resolution that in 1950, the United Nations had adopted. And the resolution was that if the Security Council gets paralyzed, Security Council cannot move because of veto, then under those circumstances, the General Assembly of the United Nations has residuary powers. The primary responsibility for international peace and security, that primary responsibility is that of the Security Council. But secondary responsibility is with the United Nations General Assembly. And so under those circumstances, when the Security Council cannot act, then the Security Council might send the issue to the UN General Assembly. Well, you'll ask me a question, why can't Russia veto that? And here the point is that this issue is not substantive, it is procedural. And on procedural issues, no veto. So out of 15, if 9 members vote for it, it can be sent to the General Assembly. So this time, Ukraine issue went to the General Assembly. For the first time, after many, many years, because once in the past it had happened, but after many years, decades, the Security Council sent the issue to the General Assembly, and for the first time, General Assembly took a very strong action. It said any time veto is used, that was last, you remember, it was March, February 24, last year, a year ago, that the Russian forces moved into Ukraine. So it was then, in March, that the United Nations adopted a resolution in General Assembly. And the resolution was that any time veto is used, then that country must come to the General Assembly and tell us what the rationale is. Now, I gave you all this background so that you understand veto. And now, very briefly, I want to mention to you why India ought to be a permanent member. Today, problems in the United Nations are multidimensional. There is climate change. There is environmental degradation. There is drought. There are floods. Economic, financial institutions, the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, they need reform also. So the problems in the United Nations are multidimensional. And multilateralism, which is part of the United Nations, that decisions are to be taken in a fashion, excuse me, that they're proper. 51 members at the time United Nations was formed. Now, I'm not going to ask you, but it's 195 members, 4 times, and still 5 permanent members. And who are those 5 permanent members? France, England. Now, at the time of the Second World War, they were powerful countries. Where are they today? You think about Britain. And you know, there was a time when one of my friends from Britain told me, said to me, he said, you know, there was a time that the sun never set on the British Empire, meaning thereby anywhere in the world, there were so many countries under the British domination that somewhere sun had been rising. He said, sun never set on the British Empire. He said, now it never rises. And the meaning thereby that Britain is the one where it's always kind of cloudy and always kind of, you know, without sun most of the year. So he said, now sun never rises. So Britain is there, France. Where is France today in the international arena? It has got no power. It's a faded glory, and it still is sitting there as a permanent member. Where is Japan? Where is Germany? Where is Brazil? Where is India? In Latin American countries, all Latin American countries, there's not a single member. There's not a single member among 51 African countries. There is one member in Asia, and that is China. And then you have 4 of them: US, France, Britain, Russia, all those Western powers. And from Europe at the present time, if you consider Russia as part of Europe, 3 of them. 3 of them from Europe, United States, and China. India has got a very important reason to say that it ought to be as a permanent member. Let me count the ways. Look at demography, population. It's going to be the most populous country in the days to come. Look at the economy. Today, the 5th, it will be the 4th biggest economy in the world. Look at the impact of India in the international arena. It has sent more peacekeeping people around the world than other countries. Look at its help to the people. It has given vaccine to the whole world. Around its neighborhood, pretty tough neighborhood, it's the one that has been helping many countries. So given all that, its economy, its military, its impact in the international arena, its contribution to the international community, India ought to be a permanent member. It ought to be a permanent member if you want the United Nations to meet its own objective and goal. The goal and the objective is international peace and security. In order to do that, you do need diversity. You do need relevance. Security Council, United Nations, no longer is relevant. It cannot meet its international objectives. India is needed there. India will look back at India's history. You ought, all of you, to be very proud. It has got ancient culture. It has got traditions. It has a very rich history of its own. Given all that, because you have ancestors, you have ancient history, unparalleled intellectual life, spiritual life, all kind of setting that you can think of. India presents, India embodies all those virtues that you can think of as human beings who ought to be good. I won't keep talking, because as a law professor, I can keep talking all day, but I think I'm going to stop very soon. But I want to simply make a point for you that in the days to come, there is no doubt that India ought to be a member. At the present time, but for China, every country, even permanent members, Russia, United States, France, England, they have all publicly stated over and over again that India ought to have a permanent seat in the Security Council. President Obama came here in Parliament, he said that. President Biden, just the other day, again made a statement that he would like to see India as a permanent member of the Security Council. Russia's foreign minister has said many times. England has said the same thing. France has said the same thing. And the sad part is that many of them know that China is going to veto it. So their statements, I think they are wonderful statements, but unless they really want to make it happen, and then they can't make it happen, because United Nations change cannot happen without vetoes. And every country of these 5 has got a veto in order to bring about any amendment in the UN Charter. Not that there haven't been efforts at reform. Many, many efforts at reform. And I have had the privilege of writing about some. But just recently, the person who brought about that change, and I had the privilege to be with him on one of the forums to speak. And he's the one who had brought this change, that any time veto is used in the General Assembly, let the country come and give a rationale for why they use the veto. And we were together, and he told me that, he had waited 2.5 years because of COVID, because he had this 3-4 years ago, presented it to the General Assembly, and he's an ambassador, and because he can speak there, finally he succeeded. So I think I briefly mentioned to you about the veto power, and briefly mentioned to you why India ought to be a permanent member of the Security Council, and that will be helpful to the United Nations, that will be helpful to the entire world. I want to thank you for your patience. I want to thank you for your attention. I don't see many faces, but I hope that you are there. And if you are, and if Kirti thinks that you can ask any question or make any comment, I'm happy to take them.
Thank you.
Simaji, I'm here. So any question, any comment, I'm happy to answer.
So I
Somebody-
request any of you to moderate the question and answer session.
Sure, ma'am. Thank you so much for this enriching and enlightening keynote session, sir. We are highly privileged and lucky to get this opportunity yet again, and we cannot thank you enough for taking time out for this keynote, sir. We'll now have a moderated Q&A session carried forward by Suryansh, our second-year executive committee member. Over to you, Suryansh.
Thank you, Sharad. It is now time for Q&A session where we have meticulously selected some questions from the audience. It will be a short session moderated by me where sir with his infinite wisdom will answer your questions. Sir, with your permission, should we start?
Please go ahead.
Sir, first question is from Aarti Kumari from CLC. She asked, "Sir, how will being a permanent member of UNSC change India's position in globally, especially in South Asian regions?"
The point simply would be that at the present time, there is China. And China's effort at the present time to use its own hegemony, and especially in the South China Sea, where it again has got, because of its own veto and what it's doing, all those little shoals and trying to militarize and make them islands and to say to the entire world that South China Sea is mine. You cannot go through it without my permission. India being in the Security Council as a permanent member, as a seat, as being at the table, will have a say on all those issues. And along with that, because China's grip in that South Asia, Southeast Asia is pretty firm at the present time. India being there can moderate it. India being there is going to be able to have at least a counterweight to China. And I think that will be very helpful to the planet itself and to South Asia.
Right, sir. So second question is from Sanstuti from CLC. She will ask the question to you directly, sir.
Good afternoon, sir. Sir, my question to you is that can changing the membership procedure of the Security Council improve its credibility? And what could be the best way to improve the Security Council? Either expand the permanent membership or totally abolish the system of permanent membership?
I wish I could give you the answer, but as you know, there is no answer, because at the present time, without that veto, and unless there is a way to have them not use that veto, because there have been many, many efforts at reform, and one of the efforts has been that if the Security Council member is involved in a conflict or in a dispute, then voluntarily that member should recuse itself from voting. But that has not been accepted. And so long as in the charter that veto remains, there is no way that we can find a way out of it unless there is an agreement among members not to use that. So you cannot coerce them, you cannot convince them. They are the ones who have got to make that decision. And that is impossible for us to say how it's going to happen. I wish I had a magical wand, and I wish that I had that very clear look into the future, and unfortunately, I don't.
Thank you, sir. So next question comes from Apurv. He's from CLC2. He asked, of the late credibility of United Nations as a global organization is being questioned. What is your take on reforms in multilateral institution in the background of current geopolitical scenario?
Well, very good question. And I think this is, all of your questions are first rate. So Seemaji, you can be very proud of it. But what really it means is that today, you remember when initially the United Nations began, the thought at that time was that we ought to have financial, we ought to have trade, we ought to have political architecture. So at that time, the thought was that we'll have the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and the World Trade Organization and the United Nations. So those were the pillars. But it didn't happen because in Havana, the conference took place in order to have an international trade organization. That totally fizzled out because in the United States, the Senate said, no go, we're not going to do that. Because the United States at that time said, and didn't say that, but the purpose behind all that was no third-party decision making. United Nations at that time was a superpower. It had all the elements that meant anything in its own hands. So the United States was not willing even to have an international trade organization begun. So at the present time, the need is to reform the World Trade Organization, reform International Monetary Fund, reform the World Bank. I could take the entire day talking about how to reform them, but that is where at the present time it's needed. And she's right. We do need to bring about all those changes in multilateral institutions in order to make it all become relevant. But please keep all of you one thing in mind. We can all be very critical. We can all be skeptical. Do not become cynical. Do not give up. There is no other game in town. This is the only game in town. And so if this is the only body that we have, we need to strengthen it. We need to make sure that it functions. If the need is for new laws, new norms, new institutions, new procedures, do them. If the old ones need to be strengthened, strengthen them. If old ones need to be changed, change them. And change is going to be very, very slow. I wish it could be total transformation. It isn't. And we don't need to give up. We can't surrender. There is no choice. At the present time, look at climate change. That's not the current issue at the present time, but think about it. What choice do we have? Sea is rising. Drought is there. People are moving. New refugees because of climate change are there. There is no climate justice. All these big developed countries, they have promised help, they have promised money, they have promised technology. Promise is given, promise is failed. No delivery. But still we can't give up. So that's my at least 2-penny advice to you. As young people, you are the ones tomorrow's future. Keep that hope, keep that promise. Do not give up.
Right, sir. So with your permission, should I ask one or two more questions, sir?
Sure.
So next question is from Vipul Shukla. He is from CLC. He asked, sir, what impact would India's inclusion as permanent member of UNSC have on the geopolitical relations with China?
You know, that is imponderable. We can't really see that. But the point simply would be that whether India is a permanent member or non-permanent member, China is always going to be a question mark, and relations with China, whether a permanent member or not, whether a part of the Security Council or not, it's going to continue to be there. India being a permanent member of the Security Council would simply mean that it will have weight in the Security Council and it will have a place at the table, and so it can talk as an equal there. But beyond that, how it all plays out is going to depend upon people, how she feels, how Jayashankarji does, how Modiji does. It all really depends upon how all these players act in it and how geopolitical considerations move.
Right, sir. So this question comes from Sonali. She is from LC2. She asked, in the light of recent controversies and UN's limited presence, such as in Afghanistan crisis and tackling COVID-19, has the United Nations become ineffective and outdated?
Amen. It has become ineffective. It needs to become effective. But again, as you know, we've talked about it. It's inadequate, it's ineffective. But that's the only game in town. You don't have anything else. If you don't have a United Nations, you'll have to create one. If you don't have a United Nations, there will be chaos. Between chaos and this inadequate setting, there is no choice.
Right, sir. So last question is from my side. I want to ask.
From you?
Yes, sir, from my side.
I'm not answering it.
Sorry. All right, sir.
Go ahead. Please go.
So my question is, sir, if we are expanding the permanent council from 5 to, let's say, 6, aren't we watering down the essence of permanent council or the position it holds in the international arena?
I don't think it will happen. I think it's not going to be 6. If you're thinking about permanent members, there might be 7. And I think the point simply is 8. Or there might be no permanent members, but the United India is a non-permanent member. I don't know how it's going to work out. But the point simply would be that all these issues have been raised. It will become unmanageable. You raise the numbers, it won't work. So, it's all in the abstract setting. All that you have to do is to be able to get it done initially and then see how it operates. Because in theory, in abstraction, we can't really determine how it's going to eventually look.
Right, sir. Thank you for this answer, sir. And thank you for enlightening us, sir. I truly believe that students have learned a lot from you, sir.
Just a minute, Surya. Just a minute. Sir, can I ask you a question?
Seemaji, no difficult question, okay? If it's an easy one, I'll answer it.
Sir, I just have a query, sir. It seems that the intention of the powerful nation from the very beginning regarding the creation of United Nations was up to a certain extent, as per my understanding, that was nullified. Because in the framing of the rules in the UN Charter, the biggest problem is once you are the permanent member of the UNSC and some proposal is pending against you, you can also exercise your veto power. So it automatically reflects that they are violating the fundamental principle of rule against biasness. So in this way, any time any such kind of action by UNSC cannot be taken against these 5 permanent members because they can exercise their veto power. So that is going to give them unlimited immunity. And the second thing which is basically constantly igniting my mind is the permanent membership. Once it has been decided that which countries are going to be the permanent membership, the economic and strategic power is a very, very important and decisive factor. Now, in the changing world order, as you have already mentioned about the financial condition of UK and France, and I am quite sure that in the coming years, Russia, several other European countries, and even America, it seems difficult that they will remain, to protect or to save their supreme power position for a very long time, because it is very clear that a new world order may come up and India may come up in a very strong position. So, sir, my question is, if BRICS nations, they become stronger, then can you see in the coming coming years or coming decades, a new world order under the leadership of new regime, because the procedure of amendment of UN Charter seems quite difficult, and I don't think that ever these 5 countries are going to let go their power away. So that is my question to you, sir. What is the future, and how much is the possibility of rising a new world power parallel to the United Nations, or these 5 permanent members of Security Council?
Very good. I think, let me just have an assumption that underlies the 5 permanent members. You remember, all of you or don't, that the idea simply was that collective security, that these 5 are going to be using this power in a very responsible fashion. At the time in San Francisco, all these 5 said, each one of them, that don't think that we are ever going to misuse this power. They said they'll never misuse this power. And they started misusing this power from the very beginning. Simaji asked, is there a possibility of an alternative? That these 5 permanent members and the United Nations, that we can substitute another organization instead of that, and that will become part of the real world order. And I wish that would happen. I don't know when, I don't know how, but I think those who have given it a great deal of thought, they are thinking that it's going to be 2030 and beyond that the change is likely to happen. How this change is likely to happen, nobody at this stage can envisage. But the possibility of that change, as Simaji said, is there. And I think a reform of the United Nations, because these members might be compelled even to leave this veto power or not to use it, could also be there. But I think it will depend upon the geopolitical considerations and how they shape up and how they affect. I think we can make all these different models, but those models are simply models. And you can't really tell how they are going to shape up. I wish I had that insight that I could share with you, but I don't. And at the present time, what I do see is that hopefully the United Nations Security Council can somehow agree to expand it, not in a fashion that it will become unmanageable, but in a fashion where at least the current geopolitical considerations are being reflected properly. And if that reflection is proper, then I think India, Brazil, Japan, maybe Germany, maybe South Africa, maybe Nigeria, some of them will have the opportunity to be there. For example, from Latin America, definitely there is Brazil. And Brazil, Japan, Germany, and India, G4, they have been looking at it for a long time as to be part of it. And our very good friend, Pakistan, is the one that always looks at India and says no. And so we'll look into how it all shapes up. But one thing I do want to say to you, you are the ones who are going to provide the leadership in the future. Get ready for that. And Simaji is a good leader.
Sir, one last point which I just wanted to mention you, and I also want to know this answer from your side, that all these 5 permanent members, they never had a good track record for human right protection. They all have a history of destruction So do you think that at this point of time, when we are analyzing the role of India in the new world order, if India reclaims its position and the world recognizes it, then it is going to serve the better interest of the entire world, because we have a great history of human right protection and great history of non-restriction, non-interference in other territories and all. So this was a big fault on the part of United Nations for not keeping India in a strong position under the United Nations Security Council.
Very well said. Doesn't need a response. Eloquently presented. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Over to you, Suryansh.
Thank you, ma'am. And thank you, sir, for this enlightening session. I truly believe that this session proves to be a learning lesson for a lot of students. I would now like to hand over the mic to Vandana ma'am for a vote of thanks.
Thank you so much, Suryansh. This was indeed an excellent address, followed by such intriguing interaction. And very good afternoon, everyone. And I believe that there could be no better way to have an academic discussion on such pertinent topic, that is India's permanent membership in UN Security Council. So at the outset, I would like to express my heartfelt thanks to our professor in charge, Professor Alka Chawla, for her constant encouragement and motivation to organize this keynote address by Professor Ved P. Nanda. And on behalf of Debate and Discussion Society of Campus Law Center, I take this opportunity to express our heartfelt gratitude to Professor Ved P. Nanda, who ignited our minds with his scholastic speech. And I thank you, sir, from bottom of my heart for acceding to our invitation for this lecture. Thanks for sharing your valuable insights on such pertinent area. And thanks for giving us historical perspectives into UN Security Council, and on emphasizing, I like this, that in the years to come, India ought to be a member in UN Security Council. And this is going to be useful not merely for the UN, but for the entire world. Thank you so much, Professor Nanda. I would also like to thank all the attendees for their involvement in this address, and we look forward to your participation in future events as well. Thank you so much, Dr. Seema Singh, who is convener of Debate and Discussion Society, and the entire debate discussion team for organizing this lecture on the pertinent issue. So thank you, everyone, once again. Have a wonderful day ahead.
Well, thank you. And kindly give my regards to Alka ji and Vandana ji. Thank you. Seema ji, thank you. And if there are other colleagues, thank you. And thanks to all of you for being here, for very good questions, for very good comments. And look forward next year again to seeing you, and hope to see you in person.
Thank you, sir.
Namaskar.
Thank you so much, sir. See you in the evening.
Namaskar. Goodbye.
Namaskar. Bye.
Live stream. Suryansh, have we closed the live stream?
Aman, just close the live stream एक बार. I'll do it.